Welcome to The Winner's Voice, where timeless books inspire powerful minds and lasting success. Today, we begin The Value of Money by B.M. Anderson. This is Part 6. Let's begin. Chapter 19. Statistical Demonstrations of the Quantity Theory, the Rediscovery of a Buried City. In the following chapter, as in most of the preceding chapters, constructive doctrine is aimed at, even though the discussion takes, in considerable part, the form of critical analysis of opposing views. We shall seek to set forth the facts, as far as may be, regarding the relations of banking transactions to trade, the relations of clearings to amounts deposited in banks, the relation of New York City clearings to country clearings, and of New York bank transactions to bank transactions in the rest of the country. We shall seek to ascertain the extent of variability in that highly elusive magnitude, velocity of circulation, particularly v. We shall indicate something of the bearing of index numbers of prices on the theory of the value of money as here presented. In reaching conclusions on these and related matters, we shall build on the investigations of Dean Kinley, on the very interesting statistical studies of Kemmerer and Fisher based on Kinley's figures, on investigations more recently made by the American Bankers Association regarding the relation of bank transactions and bank clearings, on figures from reports by the Comptroller of the Currency, as well as on other sources. One purpose of the chapter is to criticize the statistics which purport to prove the quantity theory. The bulk of the chapter is given to this. But the work of Fisher and Kemmerer thus criticized yields rich rewards for the study. The conclusions they have drawn from their figures are, in the judgment of the writer, untenable, but the figures themselves are of immense interest and importance. The controversy over the quantity theory has been waged with many weapons. Theory, history, and statistics, to say nothing of invective, have been freely employed. In large measure, the statistical studies have been concerned with the direct comparison of quantity of money and prices in their variations from year to year. One of the best of these studies, that of Professor Wesley C. Mitchell, in his History of the Greenbacks, followed by his Gold, Prices and Wages under the Greenback Standard, has, to the minds of many students, including the present writer, put it beyond the pale of controversy that the fluctuations in the gold premium and in the level of prices in the United States during the Greenback period, both for long periods and for daily changes, were not occasioned by changes in the quantity of money, but rather, primarily, by military and political events and other things affecting the credit of the federal government, together with changes affecting the values of gold and of goods. Professor Mitchell's discussion is so detailed and thorough that what controversy remains relates, not to his facts, but rather to the possibility of interpreting those facts in harmony with the quantity theory, by repudiating the notion that the direct comparison of gold premiums or of prices with quantity of money gives a valid test. Recent defenders of the quantity theory have undertaken the examination of more complex statistics than those concerned with the simple concomitants of quantity of money and prices. Two of these studies, the first by Professor Kemmerer and the second by Professor Fisher, are so elaborate, have commanded such general attention, and have been accepted by so many students as conclusive demonstrations that I feel it proper to give them detailed examination. I do this especially because highly important facts for our construction argument emerge from this critical examination. Kemmerer's and Fisher's studies reach high water mark in the effort to give statistical demonstrations of the quantity theory. If they are invalid, then I know no other attempts which many students would suppose to be possible substitutes. The theory involved in both these studies is clearly stated by Professor Kemmerer. A study of this kind, to be of any value, must cover the monetary demand as well as the monetary supply. Any test of the validity of the quantity theory consisting merely of a comparison of the amount of money in circulation with the general price level is as worthless as would be a test of the power of a locomotive by a simple reference to its speed, without taking into account the load it was carrying or the grade it was moving over. This criticism of many previous studies is, in general, I think, valid, though I should accept from this list such detailed studies as that of W. C. Mitchell, who takes account, as far as may be, of all the variables involved, and who considers day by day and week by week changes. I think the older studies of Tooke may also be accepted. In point of fact, if one wishes to know how much reliance may be placed in the quantity theory as a basis for prediction, when one knows that money is increasing, the simple comparison of money and prices is a fair test. If the other things which must be equal are so numerous and complex that the quantity theory cannot manifest itself in a direct comparison, much of its significance as a basis of prediction is gone. It is perfectly true, however, that studies running through long periods, which give simply figures for general prices and figures for quantity of money, omitting volume of trade, are not very relevant either for proof or disproof. and the conception underlying the studies of Kemmerer and Fisher that not merely money and prices, but also volume of bank credit, volume of trade, velocity of monetary circulation, and velocity of bank credit must be measured, undoubtedly represents a big advance in the conception of the statistical problem involved. The mere stating of the problem is an intellectual achievement of no mean order, and the ingenuity and scholarship involved in seeking data for concrete measurement of these highly elusive elements must command the admiration of every student of monetary problems. Volume of trade, velocity of money, and velocity of bank credit had been generally supposed, until these studies were undertaken, to be beyond the reach of the statistician. There can be no doubt at all that the efforts to measure them, or to measure variations in them, by Kemmerer and Fisher, have greatly advanced our general knowledge of the phenomena of money and credit. With great admiration for the magnificence of the problem undertaken, and for the industry, ingenuity, and scholarship which have been devoted to its solution, I have nevertheless reached the conclusion that the figures assigned by these writers to the magnitudes of their equations of exchange are, with the exceptions of the figures for money and deposits, widely at variance from the real facts in the case, and second, that if they were correct, they could in no sense be said to constitute proof of the quantity theory. In the critical analysis which follows, chief attention will be devoted to Fisher's statistics. His is the later study, and it follows, in main outlines, the methods laid down by Kemmerer. He has employed Kemmerer's statistics in considerable part, amplifying them for later years, using some data not available when Kemmerer wrote, and undertaking a fuller solution of certain problems than Kemmerer did. I shall, however, from time to time make reference to Kemmerer's figures, and show points of difference between the two studies. Let me first briefly state the second point of my criticism of these studies, namely, that even if the statistics are correct, they do not constitute proof of the quantity theory. The statistics purport to be concrete data filling out for different years the equation of exchange. But the equation of exchange, as we have seen, does not prove the quantity theory. The quantity theory is a causal theory, and causation involves an order in time. The concrete figures for the equation do not prove that. Even Kemmerer's concluding chart on page 148, showing a rough concomitance between relative circulation and general prices, does not show that changes in relative circulation are causes of changes in general prices. The causation might be the reverse for anything his figures tell us. Fisher himself recognizes this, in considerable degree. As previously remarked, to establish the equation of exchange is not completely to establish the quantity theory of money, for the equation does not reveal which factors are causes and which are effects. Again, but, to a candid mind, the quantity theory, in the sense in which we have taken it, ought to appear sufficiently secure without such checking. Its best proof must be a priori. The main criticism here, however, relates to the figures themselves, rather than to their meaning. The figures given by Professor Fisher are concrete magnitudes to fill out his equation of exchange, MV plus MV equals PT for the years since 1896. Thus, for 1909, the figures are M equals 1.61 billions, M equals 6.68 billions, V equals 21.1, V equals 52.8, P equals $1, T equals 387 billions. Now in what follows, I shall challenge all these estimates except P for 1909, V for 1896 and 1909, and M for all years. The figures for M and M, being the results of fairly simple computations based on governmental statistics, need not be questioned. P for 1909 is arbitrarily placed at $1. V for 1896 and 1909, for reasons which will later appear, is better based than for other years, though Kemmerer and Fisher have differed greatly in their estimates for V, the former placing it at 47 and the latter at 18 or 20. My criticisms with reference to V, however, will relate to the years other than 1909 and 1896. The sources from which these absolute magnitudes are drawn are, primarily, two investigations by Dean David Kinley, one in 1896 and the other in 1909, in cooperation with the Comptroller of the Currency. The purpose of these investigations was to ascertain the proportions of checks and money in payments in the United States. Banks of all kinds, national and state banks, trust companies, private banks, etc., were requested by the Comptroller to supply data for a given day, March 16th in 1909, showing what their customers deposited on that day. They were asked to classify these deposits as cash, on the one hand, and as checks, drafts, etc. on the other. They were also asked to give a cross-classification of the same deposits as retail deposits, wholesale deposits, and all other deposits. In 1909, over 12,000 banks of all kinds, out of about 25,000 banks, replied, and of these replies 11,492 were in available form. These replies showed a total of deposits of over $688 million. Of this total, 647 millions were in checks, so that checks made up 94.1% of the whole. About 60 millions of this total were retail deposits, about 125 millions were wholesale deposits, and the rest, about 503 millions, were classed in the all other category. Kinley's use of these figures, for his purpose, seems to me in every way conclusive and safe. He was interested merely in the question of the proportions of checks and money in payments, retail, wholesale, and all other. The absolute magnitudes of the elements in the equation of exchange he was not trying to measure. Professor Fisher's use of the figures presents a different problem. Let us consider, first, Professor Fisher's estimate of MV, taken together. MV is considered to be equal to the total amount, in dollars, of checks deposited during the year. To get this, for 1909, Kinley's figure, above, for checks deposited in 11,492 banks on March 16, 1909, is used. This figure is 647 millions. As half the banks had not reported, an estimate for the non-reporting banks was obtained from Professor Weston, who had aided Dean Kinley in the investigation and who had access to the original data. Professor Weston estimated the total checks deposited during the day at 1.02 billions. The question then arose as to whether this day was typical for the year. Professor Fisher found New York City bank clearings of March 17, the day after, on which these checks would get into the clearings, to be 28% below the average for the year. He assumed the rest of the country to be half as abnormal as New York City, and increased the 1.02 billions to 1.20 billions, getting what he conceived to be the daily average of checks deposited in the United States in 1909. Multiplying this figure by 303, the number of banking days in New York City, and so, presumably, a fair average for the number of banking days in the country, he obtained 364 billions for the checks deposited in 1909. This figure he considered to be MV, the volume of bank deposits, multiplied by its velocity of circulation. To obtain V, therefore, his problem was simple. He divided the figure for MV by the figure for M previously obtained from government statistics and obtained V's. Now I wish to call attention to three important errors involved in this calculation of MV for 1909. 1. The assumption that the total check circulation is the same as the volume of checks actually used in trade is a violent one. Payments may be tax payments, loans and repayments, gifts, what not. Many checks may be used in a single transaction. Surely not all of this is properly to be counted in the MV of the equation of exchange. But this topic is better discussed in connection with the estimate for T, and I reserve its fuller discussion till then. 2. The assumption that the rest of the country was abnormal in its clearings on March 17, 1909, is a pure assumption, which investigation does not verify. The rest of the country was, in fact, nearly normal. The error that comes for the year from increasing the total on this assumption amounts to at least 31 billions. The total for the year, on Professor Fisher's method of computation, with the correction to make the assumption regarding outside clearings correspond with the facts, is 333 billions, instead of 364 billions. As the figure for 1909 is a basic figure, on which figures for other years are calculated, this error is extremely significant. 3. A yet more serious error in this computation is the assumption that New York City was complete in Kinley's figures, while the rest of the country was incomplete. This error, as we shall see, largely neutralizes the error above, so far as the finally adjusted figure for 1909 is concerned, but it makes a vital difference in the figures for other years, as will appear, since it affects the weighting of New York clearings and outside clearings in the index of variation by means of which MV for years other than 1909 is determined. The assumption that New York is complete, in Kinley's figures, and that all of the extra hundreds of millions added by Professor Weston in his estimate for the non-reporting banks belongs to the country outside New York, is made by Professor Fisher both on pages 444 to 445, in estimating MV for 1909, and on page 446, in finding an index of variation for MVs. The only reason given, so far as I can find, is the following: this figure, being for New York, italics mine, is probably nearly complete. Locke. Cit. Page 446. With this as a basis, Professor Fisher proceeds in his calculations to treat the figure for New York, $239 million, as absolutely complete, and gives the rest of Professor Weston's $1.02 billion for the day, or $786 million, to the country outside. The error above mentioned, of assuming the rest of the country to be abnormally low on March 17 in its clearings, still further increases the amount assigned to the rest of the country in the total figures for the year. The conclusion finally is that New York had deposits of $93 billion in checks for the year, while the rest of the country had deposits of $271 billion in checks. As New York clearings for the year were $104 billion, while clearings for the rest of the country were only $62 billion, Professor Fisher concludes that New York clearings overcount New York check deposits, and outside clearings greatly undercount outside check deposits, so that, in the index of variation of check deposits, for years other than 1909 and 1896, New York clearings should be given a weight of only 1, while outside clearings should be weighted by 5. That is, on the basis of 1909 figures, 5 times the outside clearings plus once the New York clearings should be a good barometer of check transactions. p. 447. All this rests on the assumption that New York figures for March 16, 1909, were complete, and the only reason assigned is, being from New York. Now the figures from New York were not complete, and New York clearings do not overcount New York check deposits. Outside clearings do not undercount outside check deposits nearly to the extent that Professor Fisher assumes. For each of these 3 statements I shall offer what would seem to be conclusive evidence, and I shall attempt to get an estimate of the real relation between New York check transactions and check transactions for the rest of the country. First, the figures for New York were far from complete. It may be noted that Dean Kinley, in his volume for 1909, is very careful to repudiate the assumption that the cities were complete more than the country. Moreover, it is a mere assumption that the non-reporting banks are mainly the small banks in the country districts. A great many city banks also did not report. Italics mine. That this is true for New York is abundantly evident from figures there given for the private banks and the trust companies, not to consider at all the state and national banks. New York shows only $1,751 in checks deposited in the all other deposits in private banks. This is a city which includes among its private bankers J. P. Morgan & Company, Kuhn, Loeb & Company, J. and W. Seligman & Company, and others. Figures from these banks appear nowhere in Kinley's totals, since deposits made by these banks in other banks are also excluded from Kinley's figures. Of course, exact figures cannot be given to show how much New York would be increased had the private banks made full reports. We have no reports of any kind from these institutions. Every feature of their business is kept from the limelight, as far as possible, a practice which is much to be regretted, since it arouses hostility and suspicion, where a statement of the facts in the case would frequently entirely dispel them. We have, however, some information regarding the magnitude of their deposits, meaning by deposits, not what Kinley means in this investigation, namely, checks, etc., deposited on a given day, but rather, deposits in the balance sheet sense of demand obligations to depositors. In November 1912, J. P. Morgan & Company held deposits of $114 million, exclusive of $49 million on deposit with their Philadelphia branch of Drexel & Company. About half of these were deposits of interstate corporations. Kuhn Loeb held, on the average, for the 6 years preceding 1913, over 17 millions of deposits of interstate corporations. What their aggregate deposits were, we do not know. These figures are obtained from the report of the Pujo Committee. Morgan's deposits were equal by only 3 banks and 2 trust companies in New York, as of April 3, 1915, and Kuhn Loeb's deposits for interstate corporations alone exceeded the total deposits of any one of the great majority of the New York clearinghouse banks and trust companies. Of course, large deposits in the balance sheet sense need not mean large deposits made on a given day. Private bankers' deposits may be inactive. But we know, first, that half of these figures for Morgan, and the whole of the figures given for Kuhn Loeb, represent the deposits of active business corporations engaged in interstate business. They are not mere trust funds lying idle or awaiting investment in securities. What the rest are we can only conjecture. That they are deposits of men and firms connected with the stock exchange in some way is highly probable. The whole drift of the statistics presented in this book, and of the argument developed in this book, would serve to show that such deposits are likely to be more than ordinarily active. I refrain from assigning any figures as to the amount of checks deposited in private banks in New York on March 16, 1909. It must have run high into the millions. It certainly exceeded the 2,000s or less, reported to Kinley. The figures for New York were, thus, incomplete. But the trust companies were also incomplete. The national banks in New York reported checks totaling $186.5 million for all three classes of deposits. The state banks reported only $38.1 million. The trust companies only $14.2 million. With aggregate deposits, as shown by their balance sheets, exceeding the deposits of national banks, the New York City trust companies reported, as deposited on March 16, 1909, less than half as much as the state banks, less than a tenth as much as the national banks, and only 6.8% of the two combined, 5.9% of the total from all three classes of institutions. These figures are hard to reconcile with the assumption that the trust companies in New York were complete on that date. It is, of course, possible that the trust companies, though having large deposits, have inactive deposits. This is sometimes held to be the case. But that the difference is so great in activity of deposit accounts between banks and trust companies is hardly credible. I have looked into this matter with considerable care, and have secured information and opinions from men intimately acquainted with the trust companies of New York from the inside. The only available quantitative measure of the activity of deposits would seem to be the volume of a bank's clearings. This is not perfectly accurate by any means, but it is the best available test. Through the courtesy of a vice president of one of the largest New York trust companies, I have obtained figures from an official of the clearinghouse, which show that in New York trust company clearings run from 20 to 25% of the whole. On this basis, the trust company figures for 1909 were incomplete to the extent of from 33 millions to 46 millions on the day in question. These clearings figures, however, are for the year 1915, and not for the period before May 1911, when the trust companies were admitted to the clearinghouse. Prior to that time, they did not deal directly with the clearinghouse, but through the member banks. Do these figures, therefore, represent the situation as it existed in 1909? The possibility was entertained that entering the clearinghouse had made a difference in the reserve policy of the trust companies, and so had made them change the character of their business, in such a way as to bring about greater activity of accounts. This question was put to the official of the trust company before mentioned, and his reply is that the state law regarding reserves, passed after the panic of 1907, had already brought about this change in reserve policy, and so no difference was made upon entering the clearinghouse. The same gentleman, by the way, replying to a question regarding the deposits in private banks in New York and the influence of such deposits on clearings, writes, "The actual figures could not be obtained from the clearinghouse. Consequently, can only say that deposits made with these houses add to the clearinghouse totals very large sums." There is one piece of evidence which would seem to negative these conclusions regarding the trust companies. In the report of the New York State Superintendent of Banks, for December 31, 1907, page 35, is a statement that during the 2 years, 1903 to 2005, the trust companies of New York cleared only 7% as much as the banks. The statement relates, however, to a period during which the trust companies not only had no clearinghouse membership, which of course was true up to 1911, but also had largely withdrawn from the privilege of clearing through member banks. Under these circumstances, even 7% would seem quite high. Inquiry was made of the Honorable Clark Williams, who was State Superintendent of Banks at the time the report was made, as to the source of the figures. Mr. Williams, in reply, defends the figures as correct for that period, but authorizes the writer to quote him as in no way surprised at the percentages given above, 20 to 25% of the total clearings, in view of developments and changes in trust company business. I conclude that the trust company figures for March 16, 1909, were exceedingly incomplete. The national bank figures were probably more nearly complete than any others, first because they are large, and second, because national banks would feel more obligation than other banks to reply to questions from the comptroller. The state bank figures, 38.1 millions, as against national bank figures of 186.5 millions, were probably incomplete also, to a considerable extent. Those state banks are not dominating factors in New York City. That they should exceed the figures for trust companies is surely evidence of the incompleteness of the trust company figures. The private banks are incomplete, with absolute certainty, since they are virtually not represented at all. Further evidence that the New York figures were incomplete, however, will appear in the data regarding our second thesis, namely, that New York clearings do not overcount New York check deposits. The aggregate check deposits reported from New York, on the date in question, is 239 millions. Clearings for that day were 268 millions, substantially exceeding the reported check deposits. Now, do clearings exceed check deposits in New York City? Evidence with reference to outside clearings in connection with bank transactions we now have in very definite and abundant form, and it will be convenient to approach the question of New York clearings, first indirectly via country clearings. We shall, therefore, take up first the thesis that clearings outside New York do not undercount bank deposits outside New York nearly as much as Professor Fisher thinks. According to his estimate, checks deposited during the year in banks outside New York, exclusive of checks deposited by one bank and another, were 271 billions. Locke. Cit. 446. Outside clearings were only 62 billions, and his conclusion is that the ratio of deposits to clearings is 4.4 to 1, or, in other words, that outside clearings amount to less than 22.8% of outside check deposits. Now an extensive investigation, covering the period from June 1913 to October 1914, inclusive, has been made by the American Bankers Association, through Mr. O. Howard Wolf, Secretary of the Clearinghouse Section. This investigation covered cities of various sizes, in various parts of the country. Its results are immensely more trustworthy than any results based on a single day, as Professor Fisher's results could be, even had Professor Fisher's method been otherwise correct. An account of this investigation is to be found in the Analyst of December 7, 1914. This investigation involves, for the period in question, a comparison of total bank transactions in each city with the clearings of that city, together with a summary covering all the cities. Total bank transactions consist of all debits against deposit liabilities of each member of the clearinghouse, whether they come through the clearinghouse or over the counter. They include payrolls, for example, which, of course, never get into clearings. They include drafts on deposits of one bank in another. In a letter to the editor of the Analyst, Mr. Wolf states that total bank transactions include all debits against deposit liabilities, whether by check, draft, or charge ticket. The only exceptions are certified checks and certain cashier's checks, both of which to an extent represent a duplication. For the period in question, clearings amounted, on the average, for all cities, to 40% of total transactions. The cities did not include New York City, as stated. Now we cannot apply this 40% at once to the question in hand. Professor Fisher's 22.8% relates to the relation between clearings and checks and drafts deposited, excluding items deposited by banks, and excluding, of course, cash deposited. What is the relation between Kinley's deposits and Wolf's total transactions? It is clear that total transactions must, in a period of time, exceed Kinley's deposits very considerably. In a general way, what goes out of a bank, and what comes into a bank, must approximately equal one another in a period of time. In a general way, a depositor finds his income and his outgo balancing. Of course, some accumulate, paying in more than they withdrew, but in general such accounts are made with savings banks. The businessman borrows from his bank, getting a deposit credit without depositing in Kinley's sense, then checks against his deposit, then receives checks in payments to himself, deposits them, building up his deposit balance again, and then checks against his deposit balance in favor of the bank to pay off his loan. What comes in and what goes out, abstracting from the growth of a rapidly expanding bank balance. But notice, in the case cited above, that total transactions include more items than Kinley's deposits show. When the bank makes a loan and gives a deposit credit, this does not, usually, show in Kinley's deposits. When, however, the loan is paid off by a check to the bank, it does show in total transactions. Moreover, when a man deposits cash in the bank, it does not show in Kinley's figures for checks deposited. When, however, he withdraws cash from the bank, or his check to another is cashed, it does appear in total transactions. Further, checks deposited to the credit of one bank in another do not appear in Kinley's figures. Checks drawn, however, by one bank on another do appear in total transactions. How great the difference is between total transactions and deposits in the banks outside New York we cannot say precisely. The cash items alone, on the basis of Kinley's figures, would make a difference of about 9% to allow 11 excess to total transactions over deposits for the other reasons listed, is surely not to make an exaggerated allowance. We thus count deposits in Kinley's sense, for the banks outside New York City, as 80% of total transactions. Since, then, clearings are 40% of total transactions, they will be 50% of deposits. This figure is more than twice as great as Professor Fisher's figure of 22.8%. Even if we counted deposits as equaling total transactions, Professor Fisher's estimate would be clearly very much too low. How, then, do we stand? On Professor Fisher's showing, the overwhelming bulk of checks deposited were in the country outside New York. 271 billions for the year, outside, as against 93 billions in New York City. If the ratio, 50%, for outside clearings to deposits was the same for 1909 that it was in 1913 to 14 for the outside banks, we shall have to revise this radically. We have 62 billions of country clearings in 1909. We would have, then, 124 billions of country check deposits. If Fisher's total figure for the country is correct, 353 billions as finally adjusted, the balance, or 229 billions, would belong to New York. New York clearings, 104 billions, would thus be less than half of New York deposits. If we count outside clearings for 1909 as only 40% of outside check deposits, outside deposits would be, for 1909, only 155 billions, as against Professor Fisher's 271 billions, a difference of 116 billions. I am sure that his error in estimating outside check deposits is at least as great as that, and that we cannot assign to New York City less than a major part of the total check deposits of the whole country. This result fits in with the figures actually reported to Dean Kinley, corrected to fit the known facts about March 17 clearings, better than Professor Fisher's estimate, by a good margin. According to Professor Fisher's estimate, New York City checks deposited are only 25.5% of the total. Kinley's actual figures give 239 millions to New York City and 408 millions to the country outside. But New York clearings were 28% below normal on March 17, while country clearings were only 2.45% below normal. Adding 28% to the figure for New York checks, we get 306 millions. Adding 2.45% to the outside checks, we get 418 millions. Of the total 724 millions, New York checks would be, then, 42.3%. We have shown reasons for considering New York deposits to be very incomplete for March 16, particularly as regards the private banks and trust companies. Comparison of the New York figures with the results indicated by the ratio of country clearings to country deposits would thus indicate that New York was much less complete than the country as a whole. Even so, I need to add but 7.3% of the total to Kinley's actual figures for New York, corrected in the light of next-day clearings, to give New York half of the check deposits. Professor Fisher must subtract 16.8% of the total from the actual figures for New York, as corrected in the light of next day's clearings, in order to get his figure of 25.5%. To vary as widely from the actually reported figures as Professor Fisher does, I should have to assign 59.1% of total check deposits to New York City. I refrain from making an exact estimate. I am content with the conclusion that something more than half of the checks deposited in 1909 were in New York. This seems to be too clear for serious controversy. The indirect approach to the relation between New York clearings and New York deposits, via the study of outside clearings in 1913 and 1914, taken in conjunction with the figures for check deposits in 1909, would seem to make it quite clear that New York clearings do not exceed New York deposits, or, indeed, constitute a substantially higher percentage of them than is the case with country clearings and deposits. Logically, assuming the correctness of the estimate for checks deposited, the case is complete. We have a simple problem in arithmetic. Given country clearings for 1909, 62 billions. Given the ratio of country clearings to country deposits, and a minimum for this ratio is clearly given in the 40% which country clearings are of total transactions. We can fix a maximum for country deposits, which is 155 billions. Then, given our estimate of 353 billions for total check deposits, we subtract the maximum possible for country deposits from it, and get a minimum possible for New York City of 198 billions of check deposits. Comparing this with the known clearings of 104 billions in New York, we find that New York clearings constitute, as a maximum possible, 52.5% of New York check deposits. If the reasons given for holding check deposits in the country to be less than total transactions are accepted, the ratio of clearings to deposits in New York City is lower. Indirect calculations, however, even when logically complete, ought to be checked up by other methods, when possible. We have some further data, drawn from an earlier period, 1890-91-92, which suggest the same conclusion. The reason commonly offered for holding that New York clearings exaggerate local New York transactions, as compared with country clearings and country transactions, is that New York is the clearinghouse for the country. Country banks send their idle cash there. Country banks pay other banks by drafts on their New York balances. Country banks send out-of-town checks to New York for collection. Businessmen in St. Louis pay businessmen in Chicago with New York exchange, etc. These items are supposed greatly to swell New York clearings. Now, several of these reasons are not at all valid. Cash shipped back and forth between New York and the interior does not get into clearings. Secondly, New York, because of the charges made for collecting out-of-town checks, has tended to lose much of the collection business. Chicago probably does a great deal more of it than New York does. However, even if checks on out-of-town banks were sent largely to New York for collection, they would not get into the clearings. New York banks send checks on country banks directly to country correspondents. Checks on out-of-town banks sent in for collection do swell clearings in Boston and Kansas City, where arrangements have been made, to the advantage of all concerned, to have the clearinghouses handle this business. But New York has not made provision for it. The only checks that get into New York clearings will be checks drawn on New York banks. These checks will be of two kinds. 1. Checks drawn by individuals and firms on New York banks. These checks will commonly be drawn by people in New York, and, insofar as they come from out of town, will represent business between New York and other places, hence New York business. 2. Drafts by banks on their New York balances. These will be of three kinds. A. Drafts sold, especially by country banks, to their customers who need to make payments in other cities. Many of these will represent payments to New Yorkers for transactions between New York and the country, hence New York business, and will appear in the check deposits of individuals, firms, and corporations in New York. B. There will also be drafts from one country bank on New York to another country bank, in which New York is truly being used as a clearinghouse. New York exchange taking the place of an intercity shipment of cash. C. Drafts by New York banks on New York banks, to avoid deficits at the clearinghouse, or, especially in the case of private bankers, between whom and brokers the line is hard to draw, for general purposes. Now, fortunately, we have some data trustworthy, even though old, for the volume of bank drafts on New York, and, more important, for the proportion of drafts on New York to drafts on banks in other cities. These figures are, as stated, from the 3 years, 1890, 1891, and 1892. For the purpose in hand, however, they are relevant, since then, as now, New York clearings were nearly twice as great, on the whole, as country clearings, and if this excess of New York clearings is due to that cause, it should have manifested itself in these figures. If the proportion of these drafts on New York to the total of bank drafts was greater than the proportion of New York clearings of total clearings, we might find reason for supposing that New York clearings were unduly swelled by this fact. But in fact, drafts on New York are not out of proportion. The figures are virtually complete for drafts drawn by all the national banks on national and other banks for the years in question. They will be found in the Comptroller's reports for the 3 years, under the caption, Domestic Exchanges. For 1890 the figures are: drafts on 000 omitted. New York dollar 7,284, 63.07%. Chicago 1,084, 9.3%. St. Louis 188, 1.64%. Other reserve cities 2,537, 21.88%. Other cities 464, 4.02%. Total 11,550, 100%. The Comptroller, Report of 1890, page 19, gives an estimate for drafts drawn by state and private banks of an additional 6,089 millions. He does not try to apportion these among New York and the other cities. There is no reason to suppose that the percentage for these banks of drafts drawn on New York would be higher than for national banks, and there is some reason for supposing that they would be lower, namely, that these institutions would lack the incentive supplied by the National Bank Act for depositing reserves in a central reserve city. The Comptroller's figures probably do not include the great private banks in New York, which deposit in New York commercial banks, and draw huge checks against their deposits. These checks, probably, however, chiefly represent stock exchange collateral loans to brokers, and so appear in brokers' deposits as well as in New York clearings, represent New York deposits. I do not use this estimate in my computations. If I did, the results, so far as proportions are concerned, would be the same, since I could do nothing but assign the same proportions to them. It will be seen that my argument rests on the proportions, chiefly. Now what difference would be made if we wiped out all these draft transactions and reduced clearings to correspond? New York clearings in 1890 were 37,660 millions. Country clearings were 21,184 millions. Let us subtract the drafts on New York from New York clearings, and the drafts on other places from the country clearings. The result is, New York clearings, 30,376 millions. Country clearings, 16,918 millions. New York clearings still retain their former status. New York clearings are still nearly twice as great as country clearings. It is not the bank drafts used in making New York the clearinghouse for the country that swell New York clearings as compared with the rest of the country. It is something else. The main explanation, as we have in part seen, and shall further see, is a mass of speculative transactions, chiefly stock exchange transactions, and loan transactions connected therewith. New York clearings grow out of New York business, primarily. The figures for the other 2 years vary little from those of 1890. What variation there is shows a growth of drafts on interior cities, and a decline of drafts on New York. New York showed 63.07% of these drafts in 1890, 61% in 1891, and 60.77% in 1892. As we have seen, the only checks or drafts that get into New York clearings are those drawn on New York banks. The checks on New York banks probably almost all represent business in which one party is a New York individual, firm, or corporation. The drafts by out-of-town banks will contain all the items, virtually, that represent clearings through New York. Not all of these, by any means, will represent such clearings. A very substantial part of them will represent exchange sold to customers to make payments in New York. We exaggerate the clearing through New York when we subtract all these drafts from New York clearings. Since, however, we treat country clearings in the same way, no error results, so far as the proportions between them are concerned. The two sets of data converge. Both from the figures of 1913 to 14, in conjunction with estimated check circulation in 1909, and from the figures of 1890 to 92, can we conclude that New York clearings do not overcount New York transactions. The conclusion would seem to be inevitable that New York is really as important in our volume of banking transactions as its clearings would indicate. This may be qualified by a recognition of the possibility that New York clearings are more efficient in handling check deposits than are clearings in other cities. Some scattering data from national banks for single days at a time indicate that a higher percentage of checks is cleared in New York than elsewhere in the country, and one observation for 5 national banks for a 10-day period shows 67% of checks deposited cleared. These checks include deposits made by other banks, as do the figures of Kemmer's observations. But there are no direct observations covering New York for a long enough period, or for enough institutions, to warrant any definite conclusions. The error of assuming clearings of March 17th in the country outside New York to be abnormally low swelled Professor Fisher's total figure for check circulation by 31 billions, as we have seen. On the other hand, the error of assuming New York City to be complete in Kinley's figures tended to make the total smaller than it would have been, since New York City was 28% below normal, and an increase of 28% applied to half of Professor Weston's figure of 1.02 billions gives about 70 millions more for the day, or 21 billions more for the year, than when the 28% increase is applied to only a quarter of Professor Weston's figure. These two errors roughly neutralize one another, and we may accept Professor Fisher's finally adjusted estimate of 353 billions for the year as roughly approximating the amount of checks deposited. How rough an estimate one gets by taking a single day as the basis for a year need not be here discussed. I should be disposed to think that an indirect calculation, via clearings, in view of our more extensive knowledge of the relation of clearings to total transactions, might well be worth more, so far as deposits outside New York are concerned. Since, however, we lack any extended figures for the relation of transactions and clearings in New York, and since even for the country we are obliged to make guesses as to the relation of checks deposited to total transactions, I refrain from trying to improve further on Professor Fisher's estimate for checks deposited in 1909, even though questioning that check deposits and MV are identical. What, however, shall we say of MV for other years? In the calculation of this, Professor Fisher relies on the absolute figures for 1909 and 1896, similarly calculated, together with an index based on New York and country clearings. In this index he weights country clearings by 5 and New York clearings by 1. The result is, of course, that country clearings dominate the index. But New York clearings are much more variable than country clearings. The range of variation in New York clearings for the years 1897 to 1908, inclusive, is from 33.4 billions in 1897 to 104.7 billions in 1906, the latter figure being more than 3 times as great as the former. The range in country clearings is from 23.8 billions in 1897 to 57.8 billions in 1907, the latter figure being 210/23 as great as the former. But more significant is the degree of year-by-year variability. The country clearings, with the exception of 1908, always rise, a steady, if not quite symmetrical, increase. New York clearings, however, go up and down, 42 billions in 1898, 60.8 billions in 1899, 52.6 billions in 1900, 79.4 billions in 1901, 66.0 billions in 1903, 104.7 billions in 1906, 87.2 billions in 1907, 79.3 billions in 1908. New York clearings are highly variable in both directions, while country clearings vary almost wholly in one direction, with a maximum difference of 6.4 billions between any 2 consecutive years, and with an average yearly variation of only 3.5 billions. When country clearings are weighted by 5, almost all of the high degree of variability of New York clearings is covered up, and volume of checks deposited for years other than 1909 and 1896 is thrown hopelessly away from the facts. It is too large by far in most years. In 1905, 1906, and probably 1901 it is too small. It does not vary nearly enough. As V for years other than 1909 and 1896 is determined, for Professor Fisher's equation, by dividing the MV, thus estimated by the M, for the year, it is clear that V as estimated by Professor Fisher is very much less variable than it is in fact. It is pretty variable even in his figures, but his figures do not nearly show how variable it is. Again, this undue weighting of country clearings, swallowing up New York, vitiates Professor Fisher's estimates for V, the velocity of money, for years other than 1909 and 1896. One of the elements in the calculation of V is the estimated V's. Since V is wrong, V will also be wrong. V is probably much more variable than Professor Fisher's figures would indicate. With great admiration for the ingenuity of Professor Fisher's speculations regarding V, I find too many elements of conjecture, and too many arbitrary assumptions, to give me confidence in the figure for any year. I refrain from going into any general criticism of his method of calculating V, however, contenting myself with the one clear point that, to the extent that the values of V for years other than 1909 and 1896 depend on the estimated MV for those years, they are less variable than they ought to be. The same conclusion regarding Professor Fisher's estimates for V have been reached, by a different method, by Professor Wesley C. Mitchell. He, too, concludes that V is, in fact, more variable than Professor Fisher would indicate. I conclude, therefore, that neither V nor V has been correctly calculated for years other than 1909 and 1896. I pass now to a consideration of T, the volume of trade, after which I shall consider P, the price level, in the equation of exchange. Let us first recall the point made in the chapter on the equation of exchange, that P and T, the price level and the volume of trade, are not independent even in idea. If one is given an independent definition, the other cannot be given an independent definition. If the equation is to be true, then P must be weighted by the numbers of each item, as hats, exchanged. P is not a mere average, but is a weighted average, and T is always the denominator in the formula for P. In developing statistics for P and T, therefore, this fact must be kept in mind, and the elements entering into each must coincide, and vary together year by year. In our chapter on the volume of money and the volume of trade, we showed that the great bulk of trade is speculation. We showed that the indicia of variation which Fisher and Kemmerer have constructed for trade, dominated by inflexible physical items of consumption and production, give wholly misleading results for every year except the base year. They give a steadily growing, inflexible figure, with little variation from its steady path. Trade, if chiefly speculation, is highly flexible, varies enormously from year to year, waxes and wanes. This point need not be further developed. At best, Fisher's figure for trade can be accepted only for 1 year, 1909. Is, however, the figure for 1909, 387 billions, an acceptable figure? Is it not decidedly too large? It is made up, it will be recalled, by taking the figures for MV and MV, adding them together to get one side of the equation, and declaring them equal to PT. P is then declared to be $1, by the arbitrary device of taking as the unit of T $1 worth of every sort of good at the prices of 1909. T is, then, 387 billions, since MV plus MV equals 387 billions. The theory underlying this is that deposits made in banks correctly represent trade. Our criticisms as to the absolute magnitude assigned to T, and hence to MV plus MV, will rest in large measure in challenging this assumption. It is our contention that deposits made in banks very greatly overcount trade. Deposits made in banks include taxes and other public revenues. They include loans and repayments and interest payments. They include gifts and benevolences, money sent by parents to children away from home, pensions, payments of insurance losses, annuities, dividends on stocks, payments to and from savings and loan associations, fines, contributions to churches and other non-commercial organizations, etc., etc. None of this represents trade. But further, whether payments are in trade or not, many times indeed does it happen that several checks are drawn in connection with the same transaction. Professor Kemmerer, entertaining this possibility, thought it might be neutralized by cases where the same check passes through several hands, making payments in several different transactions. He calls this, however, a gratuitous assumption of unverifiable accuracy, and makes no claim to have given the matter careful study. In general, I think it's safe to hold that the case where a single check passes through several hands is not important. It will happen chiefly with small checks in small places, or with small checks paid to laborers. It is the pecuniary magnitude of checks, rather than their number, that counts here. I am informed by several bankers that large checks are almost universally deposited at once. This is for several reasons. 1. The recipient of the check wishes to make sure that it is good. 2. It is unlikely that the check is of the right size for another transaction, unless the recipient is a mere agent for a third party, in which case he should, but commonly does not, pass it on to his principal, if double counting is to be avoided. 3. Every person who handles sums of any size wishes a record of the transaction, and his own cancelled check is a receipt which he would not have if he passed on the check of another. This last point will go far toward explaining why bank transactions may multiply without a corresponding multiplication of trade. The banks do the bookkeeping for modern business in increasing degree. Checks are records of high legal value. A colleague recently told me that he, in his own capacity, had just drawn a check to himself, as trustee, transferring a sum from one account to another. Another colleague, with 8 different bank accounts, estimates that over 50% of the deposits in 3 of them represent transfers from other accounts. This kind of duplication, where trust relations are involved, is enormous. Inter-corporate relations and separate bank accounts within a corporation complicate it still further. A check is drawn by a subsidiary corporation to its dividend account and deposited. A check on this dividend account is then deposited in the general account of the parent corporation. A third deposit, of the same funds, is then made in the dividend account of the parent corporation. A fourth deposit of the same funds is made in a trust fund which holds stock in the parent corporation. A fifth deposit in the personal account of the beneficiary of the trust fund. A sixth deposit may be made of a check on this fund in the personal account of the beneficiary's wife. The first 3 of these deposits, at least, will be made of the total dividend of the subsidiary corporation. Not one of these 6 deposits represents trade. Payments of wages and rents should count as trade, but payments of interest and dividends stand on a separate footing. When a man has bought a stock or a bond, he has already bought all the income which is to come from them, and to count the interest and dividends as separate items is double counting. They are payments, but not trade. Even if the dividend payment be counted as trade, however, it is counted 6 times. There is enormous overcounting as a consequence of the combinations of corporations, each of which retains its own numerous bank accounts. The Interstate Commerce Commission calls attention to great duplications from this cause in connection with railway income accounts. Even within single corporations, the duplications are very great. Thus, the local agent of a railroad deposits his receipts in a local bank. His check, or, more usually, the draft of the bank, is subsequently deposited in a bank at headquarters. Subsequent disbursements, in places away from headquarters, particularly of wages, will frequently be preceded by deposits in other local banks. This duplication will be true of telegraph, telephone, insurance, and other companies which have scattered agencies, including the wholesale trade. Advertising agencies will illustrate it. All checks between agent and principal, customer and broker, etc., will illustrate it. There is a great deal of double counting in stock transactions from this source. Thus, a Boston broker takes orders, with a check for margin, for execution in New York. The order is executed by a New York broker, who deals with another New York broker, who represents a Louisville broker, who represents a Louisville client. Now, to the extent that any checks at all pass between the Boston broker and his client, the Boston broker and the New York broker, the other New York broker and the Louisville broker, or the Louisville broker and his client, we have overcounting. Only the check between the two New York brokers is properly counted. It is, of course, well known that a small percentage of the dealings of a customer of a brokerage house is represented by checks between broker and customer. Professor Fisher states this to be about 5%. It is, however, 5% of overcounting. Moreover, through keeping open accounts, with irregular settlements of margins only, the Boston broker and the New York broker reduce markedly the checks passing between them. There is a back-and-forth flow of items which in large degree cancel one another, since the Boston broker sells in New York as well as buys there, and the New York broker, to a less degree, both buys and sells Boston securities through his Boston correspondent. But not all by any means is cancelled, and all the checks that pass in this way represent double counting. The total is large. Public funds are included in the deposits reported to Kinley. Taxes are not trade. Double, triple, and multiple counting comes as revenues are received by local authorities, transferred to state accounts, subsequently redistributed to local accounts, or to the treasurers of state institutions, transferred from one bank to another, etc. The state of Massachusetts scatters its deposits in banks all over the state, and makes transfers from one account to another. The city of Boston has many bank accounts. The federal treasury deals largely with banks over the country. Whenever a retail store has branches, duplications are likely to occur. Chain stores make great overcounting. Kiting swells bank deposits. Replying to these contentions, Professor Fisher has urged that there is large undercounting, also, and that the undercounting balances the overcounting. I have myself called attention to a good deal of undercounting in the chapter on barter. A substantial amount of ordinary trade is carried on by means of partially offsetting book credit, time bills of exchange, simple barter, etc. The amount might even run high, as compared with ordinary trade, when the clearing arrangements in the stock and produce exchanges are taken into account. But it is impossible to figure out anything at all in this line which is to be compared with the great gap between the 141 billions of trade we were able to find and the 387 billions Professor Fisher assigns to trade. The gap of over 245 billions is much too great. Besides, in our 141 billions, we have counted barter items, book credit items, time bill of exchange items, etc. already. The main item of undercounting must be in connection with the clearing arrangements in the speculative exchanges. This would seem to be Professor Fisher's view as well. Data are at hand for the two great exchanges of the country which enable us to measure, with some precision, the amount of the undercounting, i.e., to tell the extent to which checks are dispensed with in the trading of these two great exchanges. The two exchanges are the Chicago Board of Trade and the New York Stock Exchange. For the New York Stock Exchange, figures are taken from Pratt's Work of Wall Street, 1912 edition, pages 166 to 167, 180, 273. The figures are for the big year 1901, when 266 million shares were sold, more than in 1909 by 51 millions of shares, and when the Stock Exchange Clearinghouse should have done better in the magnitude of the undercounting than it did in 1909. Figures since 1901 are, Pratt states, not available. Pratt also gives figures for 1893, but does not give data as to the percentage of stocks handled by the clearinghouse, so that comparison with the 1901 figures cannot be made. In 1901, 265,944,659 shares were sold. Of these, 15% were ex-clearinghouse, i.e., not on the list of stocks handled through the Stock Exchange Clearinghouse. This 15% was paid for in full by check. The bond sales are not cleared, and so another $1 billion of checks is required for this item. If we assume, on the basis of the estimates given to the writer by DeCoppet and Doremus, and Mr. Byron W. Holt for recent years, that 25% of the 100 share sales would be added if odd lots were counted, we have another large item that does not go to the clearinghouse. Private clearings reduce the number of checks in connection with odd lots, but not so effectively as is the case with 100 share sales put through the clearinghouse. So far the clearinghouse has done nothing. What did it do with the 85% of the stocks in 100 share lots offered for clearing? The figures are perfectly definite. The 85% of the 266 million shares sold was 226 million shares. The share balance remaining after the clearinghouse had done its best was 134 million shares. The number of shares sold, then, for which checks did not have to pass as a result of the clearing process was 93 millions. In terms of dollars, we may put the same figures. The estimated money value of the 266 million shares sold was 20.5 billions. 85% of this is 17,425 millions. The certifications required to pay for the 134 million share balance was 10,930 millions. The saving in checks was, thus, 6,495 millions of dollars. This is the full extent to which the Stock Exchange Clearinghouse undercounts recorded share sales. This is less than 1.7% of Professor Fisher's 387 billions. To offset this, however, we have overcounting in the 5% of checks for all dealings on the exchange which pass between brokers and customers, as shown, and all the checks between brokers and out-of-town brokers. We shall also find items of overcounting which vastly more than offset this undercounting in loan transactions between brokers and between banks and brokers, to which we shall shortly give attention. This 6.5 billions in checks saved on account of sales of stocks is no small matter, absolutely. But this, though measuring the extent of undercounted sales, by no means measures the services of the clearinghouse to the stock exchange. Not merely stocks sold have to be cleared. Stocks borrowed are also cleared. Borrowing of stocks is not trade, but borrowing of stocks requires the passage of money and checks. When stocks are borrowed, money is loaned. A bear sells short. He has to deliver next day. He accomplishes this by having his broker borrow the stock he needs from a broker representing a bull, who is long on the stocks, and who needs money to carry them. The bull, who lends the stock, receives dividends from the bear, as they accrue, and pays the bear interest on the money lent. An enormous lot of this takes place. Moreover, to some extent, these transactions are increased artificially, in order that the broker may make his clearing sheet misleading and avoid revealing his position with reference to the market. Loans of stock and sales of stock appear alike in the transactions of the clearinghouse. Moreover, apart from the necessities of the bears for stocks to deliver, we have the necessities of the bulls for money to carry their stocks. If a broker who has borrowed largely from the banks finds his customers turning to the bear side of the market, he has an excess of funds. He may repay his loans, but they may be, in part, time loans, and in any case, he may find it just as well, if he can make a small fraction of 1% in interest, to lend to another broker, among whose customers the bulls are increasing. A vast deal of money is thus transferred, on collateral security, by means of loaning stocks. Brokers prefer to borrow money from one another in this manner, since no margins are required, in general, whereas banks would require margins. These various reasons make a vast deal of borrowing and carrying transactions, and a regular place is set aside for them on the floor, post 4, commonly called the money post. At this post, also, the banks, through brokers, lend on call, and the published call rates are established there. Of this, however, we shall have more to say later. The extent to which this loaning of stocks takes place at the money post, as compared with the loaning done privately, varies. It makes no difference, however, from the standpoint of the volume of these transactions that go to the clearinghouse whether they are put through at the money post or outside. The loans made by the banks at the money post do not affect the stock exchange clearinghouse totals. Formerly, the money post was a place where the position of the bears could be gauged in a given stock. If the demand for a stock was great, the bulls could take heart and increase the pressure. To avoid giving away this information, however, borrowing is done on a large scale privately at present. Of course, if the pressure gets too strong, it will manifest itself at the money post anyhow, since bears borrowing particular stocks will forego all or part of the interest, or even pay a premium for the stock. Now it is possible, from the figures given for the total clearings of the Stock Exchange Clearinghouse, in conjunction with the figures of recorded sales, and the percentage of ex-clearinghouse sales, to get a fairly accurate idea of the magnitude of these stock borrowing operations between brokers. The total number of shares offered for clearing by both sides in 1901 was 926,347,300. This is double the actual amount, since both buyer and seller report the same transaction to the clearinghouse, the former with a receive from sheet, and the latter with a deliver to sheet. Half this amount, or 463,173,650 shares, represents the actual number of shares to be handled. As we have seen, 226 millions of this, 85% of the recorded sales of 266 millions, represent sales. The rest, or 237,173,650, represents borrowing of stocks. Borrowing exceeds actual sales if the figures for 1901, a year of enormous sales, are representative. We have now an explanation of the prevailing opinion among brokers that the stock exchange clearinghouse dispenses with the major part of the checks that would otherwise be required. For their purposes, it does make a vast difference. Pratt's figures show that, without the clearinghouse, certifications of $27,995,896,400 would have been required, that certifications of $17,065,042,800 were obviated by the clearinghouse, leaving the balance of $10,930,853,600 of certifications which had to be used. This balance, as we have seen, is the major portion of what would have had to be paid anyhow for the stocks actually sold and offered for clearing. The saving on the actual sales is only 6.5 billions. But the saving to the brokers was, of course, much greater. Even 6.5 billions is no slight matter for any purpose except the explanation of our 245 surplus billions. Pratt gives an estimate at another place of the certifications required by the stock exchange sales, reaching virtually the same conclusion that we have reached by a somewhat different combination of his figures. He indicates that 14 billions of certifications were required, counting in the bonds, in 1901. This compares with the 20.5 billions estimated value of stock sold, and approximately 1 billion of bonds. This leaves 7.5 billions of certifications obviated on sales. This takes no account of the odd lots. If they run to an additional 25%, we have 5 billions more which are not put through the clearinghouse. My information is, however, that private clearings reduce the checks in connection with these, though not so efficiently as is the case with the big clearinghouse. Do the figures that get into the all other deposits from those connected with the stock exchange undercount sales made there? Not yet have we taken account of an item which swamps all that we have considered. I refer to loan transactions by the banks, particularly call loans. The volume of these is enormous. At the money post alone, the figures average between 20 millions and 25 millions a day. The range is from 10 to 50 millions. The major part of these loans are not made on the floor of the exchange, however, but privately, between banks and brokers. Even on the floor, no records of the loans are kept, and only estimates are available. For the loans made privately, no figures are attainable at all. The total must be enormous. One authority writes, in a letter, the total amount of money loaned at the post varies considerably, depending upon the rate. For instance, when money is under 3%, loans are largely made directly between the banks and the brokers, but when it gets over 3% and gets strong, more loans are made at the post. Some national banks make all their loans there right along, so I understand. My information from an officer of the National City Bank is that it lends the major part of its demand money on the floor of the exchange. The other chief lenders, according to the Peugeot report, are the National Bank of Commerce, the Chase National, the Hanover National, J.P. Morgan and Company, and Kuhnloeb. The same report states that the bulk of such loans are made directly between banks and brokers, and not at the money post. How do these transactions affect Kinley's figures for deposits, and so Fisher's total of 387 billions? The small dealer deals, usually, with one bank. When he borrows, he gets a credit on his deposit account, but makes no deposit that would get into Kinley's figures. But stockbrokers deal with many banks. They have one bank which certifies for them, and with which they regularly keep a balance. But for their loans, they deal with whatever bank gives them the best rate, or has the funds to spare. In time of tight money, they shift their loans with great frequency. They borrow also from one another. Money is worth money in New York, and idle funds will be lent by whomever has them for whatever the market will pay, on collateral security on call. When a broker deposits money in his bank borrowed from another bank or another broker, he gets a deposit credit which does get into Kinley's figures. He deposits a certified check, or a bank draft. The following has been described as a typical transaction by the bond expert of a Boston banking house, and has been amplified by several Wall Street men with whom I have discussed it. A, whose home bank is Bank W, has borrowed, on call, $500,000 from Bank X. Bank X calls the loan. A finds Bank Y willing to lend him enough to pay it off. Before he can get the new loan from Bank Y, however, he must get his collateral released by Bank X. Before he can do that, he must pay off the loan at Bank X. His recourse, then, is to Bank W, his regular bank, which certifies for him, and with which he keeps his balance. Bank W gives him a certified check, either an over-certification or a morning loan transaction, for $500,000, with which he pays off the loan at Bank X. He then takes the collateral from Bank X to Bank Y, and makes a new loan. He gets a draft from Bank Y, which he deposits with Bank W, and then draws another check against his deposit with Bank W to pay off the morning loan, in case the transaction took that form. Here are 3 checks for this loan transaction, 2 of which get into clearings, and 1 of which gets into all other deposits. But the checks may be multiplied. A, instead of getting a new loan at Bank Y, may call a loan from broker B, who may then call a loan from broker C, who may go to Bank Y to get the funds he needs to pay B. Here are 2 new checks in the series, both of which get into the all other deposits. Checks fly about recklessly in Wall Street, and men will turn over money many times, if 1/8 of 1% or less can stick by the way on a good sum for a few days. This is strikingly illustrated by a fact which caught my attention in the monthly bank statement of a brokerage house which I was allowed to examine. The deposits made during the month, and the checks drawn during the month, balanced to within $550 out of several millions. The broker said of this, "It would be true even for a single day, and it would be true for a year. The bank requires us to keep a minimum balance. It is to our interest not to keep more than that. If we have more at the end of the day, we lend it out. If we have less, we borrow to make up the deficiency. We try to have just that balance, and no more, to our credit at the bank at the end of every day." The handling of funds by a brokerage house is a fine art, involving both technical skill and a philosophic grasp of the factors of the money market. Are rates going up? Then it is well to reduce call loans, and borrow more on time. If lower rates are anticipated, more call money will be employed, with the possibility of a squeeze if too much is taken that way. Hidden dangers must be foreseen. The sums borrowed are enormous, and brokers' profits depend in very substantial degree on their skill in borrowing as cheaply as possible and in utilizing their funds to the utmost. It is here, I think, in loan transactions between banks and between brokers, that we have a major part of the explanation of the huge deposit figures for New York City, and for the tremendous influence of stock sales on clearings, which Mr. Silberling's figures show. This is the opinion of Professor O.M.W. Sprague, who first called my attention to the volume of call loans, and rapid shifting of call loans, in New York, and it is the opinion of every Wall Street man with whom I have discussed the matter. The actual pecuniary magnitude of the share sales and bond sales is not enough to do it. The mass of connected loan transactions, however, substantially greater in volume than the actual sales of securities, is, with the security sales, enough to do it. When the call rate is high, which will particularly happen when bank reserves are low, the shifting in loans will be much increased. One bank will have money to lend one day, but the next day will have to call it, to meet heavy demands at the clearinghouse, while some other bank will have the surplus funds to lend. The brokers, by bidding up the rate, will tempt the temporary lending even of small surpluses, if their necessities are great. The volume of all other deposits, and of bank clearings will be swelled by this much beyond ordinary. That this should not be revealed to ordinary statistical tests is due to the fact that speculation tends to fall off at such a time, so that the other factors in the stock exchange operations tend to reduce daily deposits and bank clearings. Mr. Silberling has applied to this problem the technique of a refinement of the correlation method, the method of partial correlation, with the result of confirming this view. I conclude, therefore, that stock exchange transactions, instead of being undercounted in bank deposits, are very greatly overcounted. The big item that does it is loan transactions between brokers and between brokers and banks. The evidence from the Chicago Board of Trade, with reference to the extent of clearings within the exchange there, comes in a letter from the Secretary of the Board of Trade to Professor Taussig. The only clearinghouse transactions are in connection with futures. All spot transactions are paid in full by check. All futures other than those offset by clearing are paid in full by check. The total amount put through the clearinghouse in 1915 was 118 millions, of which the balances paid were 41 millions, saving checks to the extent of 77 millions. This 77 millions is a trifle indeed as compared with the gap of 245 billions we are trying to fill. It is a trifle also as compared with the business done on the Board of Trade. The Secretary estimates that commodities to the value of $375 million actually arrived on the exchange in 1915. On the average, the figure would be $350 million. For the stockyards, it is approximately the same. Last year was $375 million. Of fruits, vegetables, poultry, butter, eggs, etc., sold in South Water Street, it is claimed by their statisticians, the value is $350 million, or a total of about 1,100 millions arriving italics mine yearly at this great marketplace, all of which is paid for by checks, and when the ownership changes, the change of ownership is always paid by check. How many times the goods change hands cannot be stated on the basis of records of the Board of Trade. The Secretary contents himself with saying that they are sold and resold many times. We have discussed this on the basis of reputed figures of the federal tax on grain futures in 1915 in our chapter on volume of money and volume of trade. In any case, it is clear that the 77 millions of checks economized, though absolutely great, is relatively a bagatelle. It is, moreover, more than compensated for by loan transactions. The Secretary estimates that for a 60-day period, when grain is coming in, from 2 to 4 millions will be lent by the banks daily on arriving grain. How great the loan transactions on subsequent sales will be we can only conjecture. While able to find, then, important cases of trade and speculation which dispense with the use of checks, I cannot find anything of magnitude sufficient to aid Professor Fisher's case, and I find, on the other hand, enormous overcounting in every field where business and banks meet, as well as in the relations of banks to non-commercial depositors. I conclude, therefore, with reference to the figures of Fisher and Kemmerer for volume of trade, that they are much exaggerated for the base year, and that for every other year they are wholly wrong, both because of their excessive magnitude, and because the index of variation has been wrongly chosen. The discussion of P, the price level, in the statistics of Kemmerer and Fisher need not be extended. P, for the equation of exchange, and for the quantity theory, is a weighted average, each price that goes into it being weighted by the number of exchanges involving the commodity of which it is the price. The weighting of P should correspond to the elements in T, the volume of trade, and should vary from year to year, as the elements in T change. Now Kemmerer's P is weighted as follows: wages, 3, security prices, 8, wholesale prices, 89. If our conclusions with reference to the composition of the volume of trade, as developed in the chapter on volume of money and volume of trade, are valid, this weighting gives us a P which has no relevance to the equation of exchange. The wholesale items should have a weight of not more than 1/6 of the total for 1909. Certain commodities, as wheat and cotton, in which there is heavy speculation, should be given great weight, and securities should have, probably, the greatest weight of all. If trade is to be extended to cover transactions in bills of exchange and loan transactions, as it is by Kemmerer, then P should contain these things, weighted more than all else put together, particularly if call loans are included. The weights should be radically altered from year to year. We should then get a P which would fit the equation of exchange, though what else it would be good for is hard to say. The same criticism applies to Fisher's P. It is dominated by wholesale prices. It therefore has no relevance to an equation of exchange in which only 1/6 at the very most of the items are wholesale items. Neither Fisher nor Kemmerer alter their weights in P at all, to correspond to yearly alterations in the composition of T. As indicia of changes in the absolute value of money, Kemmerer's and Fisher's index numbers, or other index numbers of numerous wholesale prices, with a substantial weighting of wages, are probably better than an index dominated by stocks. Stocks fluctuate more widely than wholesale prices and wages. Their values are more affected by variations in business confidence, and by variations in the rate of interest. For measuring the value of money, the index numbers here criticized are very good. But for the purpose for which they are chosen, namely, to fill the equation of exchange, and to measure variations in a price level of the sort the quantity theory and the equation of exchange are concerned with, they are simply irrelevant. If it were really true that such an index number varied with the quantity of money, then the quantity theory would be effectively disproved. Now, in general summary of our criticisms of the figures of Kemmerer and Fisher, they have systematically buried New York City and systematically covered up speculation. All the errors converge in this direction. The indicia of trade cover up speculation and the other things that go on in New York and other financial centers. The indicia of prices do likewise. Fisher weights New York clearings only 1, while weighting country clearings 5, in his index of variation of check transactions. He also counts New York returns for March 16, 1909, as complete, and gives all of his estimate for non-reporting banks to the country. Kemmerer does not do this, but he does exaggerate the importance of money, as compared with checks, and does not allow the velocity of money to vary at all in his figures, thus getting a much greater constancy in the figure for total circulation of money and checks than is proper, and covering up the flexibility and variability which New York gives to our system. In general, our task in this chapter has been an archaeological excavation. We have rediscovered a buried city. Part 3. The Value of Money. Chapter 20. Recapitulation of Positive Doctrine. The chapters which have gone before have been, in considerable degree, concerned with the analysis of unsuccessful efforts to solve the problem of the value of money, as the quantity theory, or the attempts to apply the notions of supply and demand, marginal utility, and cost of production to the problem. Not all that has gone before has been, even in form, primarily critical. The chapter on economic value lays the foundation for the main constructive theory of the book, and in virtually every chapter some portion of our positive doctrine has been developed. In the doctrines criticized, elements of truth have been noted, and in showing the errors of the doctrines considered, constructive doctrine has been presented by way of contrast. The theories criticized, moreover, even where they have gone astray in solving problems, have at least the merit of stating problems, and so have aided in clearing the way for theories better based. It is the task of the present chapter to present, in a series of theses, the main constructive results so far attained. No effort will be made to follow the order of the exposition which has preceded. A summary of that will be found in the detailed analytical table of contents. Rather, we shall seek to draw from what has preceded the positive doctrine which is scattered through the preceding chapters, and to present it by itself, as a basis for the more systematic formulation of constructive theory which the following chapters are to contain. 1. The theory of the value of money is a special case of the general theory of value. 2. Value is a phenomenon of psychological nature. Not physical quantities, but psychological significances, are relevant when the problem of value and price causation is involved. 3. Value is not a ratio of exchange, or purchasing power, but is an absolute quantity, prior to exchange. It is the fundamental and essential attribute or quality of wealth, the common or homogeneous element present amidst the diversities of the physical forms of wealth, by virtue of which comparisons may be instituted among different kinds of wealth, and different items of wealth may be added to make a sum, put into ratios of exchange, and so on. 4. Economic value is a species of the genus, social value, coordinate with legal value and moral value. It is part of a system of social motivation and control. Psychological in character, it nonetheless presents itself to an individual as an objective, external force, to which he must adapt himself. 5. Individual prices have two cooperating causes: A. The social economic value of the money unit, and B. The social economic value of the unit of the good in question. 6. The average of prices, or the price level, is a mere mathematical summary of the particular prices. The causation involved in the average of prices is nothing more than the causation involved in the particular prices. 7. The value of money is to be distinguished from the reciprocal of the price level, or the purchasing power of money. The value of money is an absolute quantity, one of the factors determining each particular price. Particular prices and general prices may change because of changes in the values of goods, with no change in the value of money. Or, particular prices and general prices may change because of changes in the value of money, with goods remaining constant in value. 8. The absolute value of money, assumed constant, is presupposed by the great body of present-day price theory, as supply and demand, cost of production, and the capitalization theory. These theories are, therefore, inapplicable to the problem of the value of money. 9. But supply and demand, cost of production, the capitalization theory, and other laws concerned with the concatenation and interrelations of prices, being applicable to the problem of particular prices, are also applicable to the problem of general prices. Chapter on the passiveness of prices. 10. The general price level, as a consequence of changes in particular prices, growing out of changes in the values of goods, may rise or fall, without antecedent changes in the value of money, or the quantity of money, or the volume of credit, or the volume of trade, or in the velocities of circulation of money or credit. Chapter on the passiveness of prices. 11. The general laws of prices, supply and demand, cost of production, the capitalization doctrine, the imputation doctrine, etc., conflict with the quantity theory. In the cases where they conflict, the first named doctrines are correct, and the quantity theory is wrong. Chapter on the passiveness of prices. 12. The value of money, being a special case of economic value, is subject to the same general laws. This means, from the standpoint of my theory, that the theory of social value is applicable to the problem of the value of money. 13. This is not the same as saying that the whole value of money is to be explained by the social value of gold bullion, conceived of as a mere commodity. A hypothetical case was constructed in the chapter on dodo bones, in which gold is the standard of value, but is not employed as a medium of exchange or in reserves, where the whole value of money is to be explained by the value of gold bullion, conceived of as a commodity. 14. But, in general, money gets part of its value from its monetary employments. Chapter on dodo bones. 15. The additional value which comes to gold bullion as a consequence of its employment as money is itself to be explained on social value principles. It grows out of the social value of the services which money performs. 16. The functions of money remain to be examined in detail, and the relation between the value of particular services of money and the capital value of money has not yet been analyzed. There is a relation between the two, a relation which varies under different conditions, even though it has been shown in the chapter on the capitalization theory that the relation is not the simple one which holds between the values of services and the capital value of ordinary income bearers. There must be an increment to the value of gold bullion as a consequence of its being coined, however, since otherwise there would be no force leading it to be coined. 17. This increment in value to bullion, as a consequence of coinage, becomes evident when free coinage is suspended. An agio of coin over uncoined bullion may easily appear. 18. But this is not to assert the doctrine of the quantity theory, because 19. The money service presupposes the existence of value for money from some source other than the monetary employment, chapter on dodo bones, and 20. Hence the monetary employment can explain only a differential portion of the value of money. 21. The proposition that money must have value from some source other than the monetary employment does not mean, necessarily, that money must be made of precious metals, or be convertible into precious metals. The value of money is, indeed, most stable and best sustained when such is the case. But it is possible for money made of paper to have value apart from the prospect of redemption, though no clear case has been made, in the writer's opinion, for the view that this has historically occurred. But as a hypothetical possibility, my theory holds that paper money may attain a value of its own, growing out of various factors which a social psychology can explain, including law, patriotism, and custom. Social values in every sphere are imperfectly rationalized. Values which in their origin are secondary and derived may become substantial and independent of their presuppositions. This is true of legal and moral values. It is true of the capital value of land. It may be true of paper money. This matter has been discussed in the chapters on economic value and on dodo bones. The social value theory has not the limitations of the utility theory in dealing with such cases, nor is it tied to a metalist or bullionist interpretation. Legal, moral, and patriotic factors, and the influence of social custom, all fall readily into the social value doctrine. 22. The measure of values function and the standard of deferred payments function need not require the actual use of money, and need not add to the value of money. The function of medium of exchange, and other functions to be analyzed in a later chapter on that topic, do involve the actual employment of money, and are sources of value for money. 23. The quantity of money and credit are matters of high importance in economic life. They affect vitally the smooth functioning of production and exchange. While not accepting the extreme view of those writers who see in scarcity or abundance of money the primary cause of the ebb and flow of civilization, I maintain that the quantity of money and credit does make a vast difference, and that the quantity theory contention that, after a transition is effected, the only consequence of a change in the quantity of money is a proportional change in the price level, is wholly indefensible. Chapter on volume of money and volume of trade. 24. Very much of economic theory has been developed in abstraction from money. For economic statics, with its delicate marginal adjustments, on the assumption that friction is banished, that the market is fluid, that labor and capital and goods are mobile, etc., money does appear a needless complication. But the static assumptions are only possible because money and credit have smoothed the way. It is the business, the function, of money and credit to overcome friction, to effect transitions, to make it possible for normal tendencies to manifest themselves. Chapter on Volume of Money and Volume of Trade. 25. The main work of money and credit is in effecting transitions, bringing about readjustments, enabling society, with little shock, to adapt itself to dynamic change. The great bulk of the actual exchanging that takes place is speculation, and would not occur if economic life were in static equilibrium. This is true both as a matter of theory and as a matter of statistics. More than half of the checks deposited in the United States are deposited in New York City, where wholesale and retail deposits are a small factor. Bank clearings fluctuate in close conformity with stock exchange transactions. Great banks, and the bulk of banking transactions, are everywhere found in the speculative centers. Chapters on volume of money and volume of trade, and the rediscovery of a buried city. 26. Hence a functional theory of money must be essentially a dynamic theory, must rest in a study of friction, transitions, and the like. And 27. Hence a theory of money like the quantity theory, concerned with long-run tendencies, and normal equilibria, and static adjustments, touches the real problem of the value of money not at all. 28. An increase of money tends to increase trade. Chapter on volume of money and volume of trade. 29. An increase of credit tends to increase trade. Same chapter. 30. An increase of trade tends to increase the volume of credit, and, where the money supply is flexible, tends to increase the money supply also. Chapter on the volume of trade and the volume of money and credit. 31. Production weights on trade. The problem of marketing in the modern world is often more important than the problems of production in the narrower sense. Selling costs are probably greater than strict costs of production. Volume of trade, far from being dependent on physical capacities and technique, is almost indefinitely flexible, with changing tone of the market, with changing values, and with other changes, including changes in the volume of money and credit. Chapter on volume of money and volume of trade. 32. The relation between the volume of money and the volume of credit is exceedingly flexible. The relation between the world's volume of credit and the world's volume of gold is likewise exceedingly loose, uncertain, and flexible. Chapters on volume of money and volume of credit, and the quantity theory and world prices. 33. Velocity of circulation is a blanket name for a complex and heterogeneous set of activities of men. It is a passive resultant of many causes, and is itself a cause of nothing. The safest generalization possible concerning it is that it varies with the volume of trade and with prices. 34. Barter remains an important factor in modern economic life, and is a flexible substitute for the use of checks and money, increasing when the money market tightens. It is greatly facilitated by the common measure of values function of money. 35. The general criticism of the mechanistic scheme of causation involved in the quantity theory has, as its positive corollary, the doctrine that psychological explanations must be given, that the phenomena are intricate and complex as the play of human ideas and emotions and the network of social relationships. 36. This means that the theory of value, and of the value of money, as here presented, cannot assume the simple form or the mathematical precision which have made the quantity theory so alluring. It means, further, that the present study, as in part pioneer work, will lack finish and definiteness in many places, will contain errors and gaps, and will leave many problems unsolved, and many distinctions undrawn. At many points, the analysis is confessedly incomplete, and the problems imperfectly thought through, often inadequately stated, if seen at all. In what follows, these theses, with doctrines yet to be developed, will be woven together into a systematic theory of money and credit. The study of the functions of money, in relation to its value, will best be approached, I think, through a study of the origin of money. In this, I shall base my conclusions chiefly on the work of Carl Menger and W. W. Carlyle, who seem to me to have done most in this field. On the basis of the general theory of value developed in the first chapter, and the results of the two chapters which are to follow on the origin and functions of money, I shall reach my main conclusions as to the laws of the value of money. On the basis of this theory of value, and of the theory of the functions of money, I shall also try to develop a psychological theory of credit, and to assimilate credit phenomena to the general phenomena of value. The development which the theory of credit has had, at the hands of men whose chief interest was that of the jurist or accountant, is valuable and important. I do not wish to discredit what has been done. Many important doctrines concerning credit have been developed. The general theory of elastic bank credit, worked out in the controversy between the currency and the banking schools, is of the highest importance. This theory I have discussed in the chapter on the volume of trade and the volume of money and credit. I still feel, however, that there are gaps in the prevailing ideas on credit which only a social psychology can fill. I shall undertake to construe credit as a part of the social system of motivation and control, and to differentiate it from other parts of that system by an analysis of its functions. I think, too, that the theory of the relation of credit and money is in especially unsatisfactory shape, particularly with reference to the factors governing reserves. A final chapter, in Part 4, will undertake to bring together the various points in our discussion which deal with the theory of prosperity, and will seek to bring the notions of theory of prosperity versus theory of wealth, statics versus dynamics, normal versus transitional tendencies, and certain other similar contrasts, into a higher synthesis, which will, to be sure, not rob these contrasts of their significance, but will rather find certain generic principles which they share, and so make it possible to measure considerations in one sphere in terms of considerations in the other sphere. In very large degree, students of dynamics and students of statics have been talking at cross purposes, missing the force of one another's arguments, and have been quite unable, even when understanding one another, to come to agreement, precisely because they have lacked principles by means of which they could compare in any quantitative way the forces which each studies. A higher synthesis, which would give static and dynamic theories common ground, would seem to be a desideratum of high importance. Such a synthesis would go far toward unifying the science of economics. I believe that the theory of money and credit, approached from the angle of the social value theory, will meet this need. Chapter 21. The Origin of Money and the Value of Gold. This chapter is not concerned with history or anthropology for their own sake. The present writer has made no independent historical or anthropological researches in connection with the question of the origin of money. The chapter is primarily concerned with giving an exposition of the theories of two writers, Carl Menger and W. W. Carlyle. It is not important, for my purposes, whether either writer has presented a theory which anthropology will accept as a correct account of actual origins. The theories do throw light on present functioning, and seem to me to be correct as analytical theories, whether historically adequate or not. There are two main questions with which the chapter is concerned. 1. How did money come to be? 2. Why should gold and silver have passed all rival commodities in the competition for employment as money? Viewing these questions from the standpoint of present functioning, rather than from the standpoint of historical origins, we may restate them as follows. 1. Why should men accept small discs of metal, or paper representatives of these metal discs, for which, as metal, they have no use, or at all events far in excess of the amount which they can make use of as metal, in return for economic commodities which they can use? The social utility of a money economy may well be granted, without giving an answer to this question. Granting that social economic life works better by far when men do accept these discs of metal in payments, the question still remains not merely as to why the practice started, but also as to why it continues. Granted that it is to the individual, as well as to the social advantage, that each individual should accept these metal discs in excess of his personal need for the metal, if he is assured that he can pass them on to others at will in return for the goods he wishes to consume, the question still remains as to why the individual should have this assurance, as to why the general practice should continue. Menger quotes Savigny as holding that the thing is downright mysterious, and the Aristotelian answer of social convention, sometimes interpreted as social contract, is, in effect, a confession that the thing does baffle explanation on the ordinarily understood laws of exchange. The convergence of individual and social advantage, which English economic theory has done so much to emphasize, is less clear by far in connection with money than with the case where A trades a sheep, of which he has a surplus, to B for a quantity of grain, of which B has a surplus, while A has not enough grain, and B has not enough sheep. This exchange is clearly to the advantage of both A and B, and the practice of making such exchanges is clearly to the general advantage. But in the case of money, A trades sheep, of which he may not have an excess, so far as his capacity to consume is concerned, for discs of metal which he probably does not intend to consume at all. The social advantage of a general practice of the sort is easily established, but it is not clear that it is to A's advantage, unless we assume the practice general. But there are many practices which could be shown to be socially advantageous if all men practiced them, and, indeed, individually advantageous, if generally practiced, which can, none the less, not be made a general practice. If thieves would cease stealing, we could dispense with a vast expense now incurred in police and safe deposit vaults and heavy locks, etc., and with a small fraction of the savings could give pensions to the thieves which would surpass by far their present incomes. Individual and social advantage would converge. But for many reasons the practice could not be instituted, and would break down quickly if instituted. Very powerful social pressure indeed is needed to make an advantageous social institution, like morality, work, so long as individuals sometimes find advantage in breaking the general practice, even though the general practice, on the part of other people, is of advantage to every individual. Now it is clear that the institution of money is to the social advantage. It is clear that it is to the advantage of every individual who has money that everyone else should be ready to accept it in unlimited amount, in return for his goods and services. But it is not clear, on the surface, why everyone should be ready to take metal discs in unlimited amount in return for goods and services. People will not take coal or horses or hay or land or white elephants in unlimited amount in return for goods and services. Why should there be such a general practice regarding metal discs or pieces of paper? This question, to one who has always lived in a money economy, may seem childish. Such questions regarding anything to which we have grown accustomed seem childish to those who have not been used to raising them. Why does the sun rise? Why does seed corn sprout? But these also are proper scientific questions, the answer to which is of high practical importance. The answer to the question just raised regarding money will go far toward explaining the functions of money, and the theory of the functions of money, together with the general theory of social value, will give an answer to the question as to how the money function adds to the value of money. The answer which I shall give on the first question will in large measure follow the lines laid down by Menger. 2. The second question needs little revision, when stated from the standpoint of present functioning, rather than of historical origin. We have more recent history to deal with in connection with this question, and Carlyle, in his answer, offers substantial historical and anthropological proofs. It is still, however, present functioning that is important, and the question may be restated thus. Why are gold and silver, and particularly gold, the standard money of the great part of the world today? The principles of social psychology which Carlyle employs in explaining the historical development are also important in explaining the present attitude of mankind toward gold and silver, and will serve, together with the general theory of social value, to answer the question as to the value which money receives from the employment of the money metal as a commodity. It is worthy of note that neither of these questions has been seriously raised or discussed by most recent writers of the quantity theory type. Professors Kemmerer and Fisher give no attention to them at all. Both assume money as circulating, as the starting point of the argument, without noticing how much is involved in the assumption. Neither, moreover, gives an analysis of the functions of money. Considerations drawn from the question as to the origin and functions of money are hard to bring into the quantity theory scheme. If money circulates, there are causes for it. Fully to understand those causes would be to understand also the terms on which money circulates, that is to say, the prices. But then a quantity theory would be superfluous. And if the quantity theory answer should not be obviously in harmony with the answer already given by the theory of origin and functions, then doubt would be cast on the quantity theory explanation. The quantity theorists do well to avoid mixing up with their discussion considerations drawn from the general theory of value, and from the theory of the origin and functions of money. The answer to the first question rests primarily in the fact that there are differences in the saleability of goods. Value and saleability are not the same thing. A copper cent has high saleability, a farm has low saleability. Some valuable things cannot be exchanged at all. The Capitol at Washington cannot be exchanged, yet has value. Under a communistic or socialistic regime, exchange, as we now know it, would largely or wholly cease. An entailed estate cannot be sold, yet has value. If society should really come to the stable equilibrium of the static state, most of the exchanges of lands, securities, and other long-time income-bearers would cease, but they would still be valuable. I have developed these notions in my article on value in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, August 1915, and have referred to them again in the chapter on value in the present book, and so need not expand the discussion here. Exchangeability and value are different characteristics of goods. Value is an essential precondition of exchangeability, but can exist without it. Value is, however, commonly increased by exchangeability. But the theory of exchangeability is a separate matter, and cannot be deduced from the theory of value alone. Menger points out the difference between buying price and selling price. You can buy a piano for $400. If you try the next minute to sell it for $375, you will probably fail. You may pay $10,000 for a farm. The income of the farm may increase. The tax assessment may increase. The capital value of the farm may increase. And yet, you may have to wait for a long time before you find a buyer who will pay you $10,000 for it. One buys pianos or farms, as a rule, only when one wishes to use them, or when one has such special knowledge of the market that one knows pretty definitely where purchasers can be found for a resale at a profit. Even in such highly organized markets as the stock and produce exchanges, one cannot usually buy in quantity and sell immediately without some loss. Buying price and selling price of such a stock as industrial alcohol preferred are sometimes 5 points apart at a given time. The forced sale of land in bankruptcies, or for taxes, notoriously often bring prices far below the price which would correctly express the value of the land. It is only in the ideal fluid market assumed by static theory, where adjustments are instantaneous, where causal temporal relations have become timeless logical relations, that values are perfectly expressed in prices. All these difficulties were enormously greater in days of primitive barter, before money and organized markets had been evolved. The difficulties of barter have been much elaborated in the literature of money. I shall recur to the topic in my chapter on the functions of money. Part of the trouble arises from the want of coincidence in barter, the failure to find the man who has what you want, and who at the same time wants what you have. Goods have high or low saleability, depending, in considerable degree, on the universality of the desire for them. They may have high value if only a few rich men desire them, provided they be scarce. The paintings of old masters would be a case in point. Incidentally, the difference between buying price and selling price is often enormous in this case, and the making of a sale may well involve long and expensive negotiations. The difficulties of exchange here arise not alone from the limited market, however, but also from the fact that each painting is a unique, and a unique of high value. A good might have high saleability despite the fact that the ultimate demand for it comes from only a few rich men, if it could be easily subdivided and standardized. Menger enumerates a number of circumstances connected with a good which increase its saleability. Among them are the following. 1. Widespread and intense desire for the thing, to which should be added adequate wealth on the part of those who desire it. 2. Scarcity of the commodity in question. 3. Divisibility of the commodity. 4. Considerable development of the market. 5. That the demand for the article should be more than local. 6. That it be cheaply transportable. 7. That commerce between localities in the article be unrestricted. 8. That demand for the article be constant, not fluctuating, in time. 9. That the article be durable. 10. That it be uniform in quality so that standardization is easy. In general, Menger's list meets the requirements often laid down for a good medium of exchange. In general, to the extent that any commodity meets these tests, it will be saleable. Commodities will vary indefinitely in the extent of their saleability. Starting with the distinction between value and saleability, and with the analysis of the circumstances affecting saleability, we may now undertake to see how money tends to develop out of a barter economy. Suppose that a man, in a barter economy, has a good of low saleability, which he wishes to trade for some other specified commodity. He finds no one who possesses the commodity he wants who is willing to trade with him. But if he can trade his article of low saleability for some other commodity of higher saleability, still not the thing he wants, he has yet made progress, he has got one step nearer the object which he does want. It will be possible now, perhaps, to trade the new article of higher saleability for the commodity he wants. If not, he can trade it for some article of still higher saleability, which he can finally trade for the article he wants. By several indirect exchanges, he finally reaches his object. Incidentally, it is erroneous to distinguish money and barter economies as economies based on direct and indirect exchange. The barter economy may well involve much more indirection than the money economy, in many cases. If there be in the market some one commodity which has a conspicuously higher degree of saleability than any other, the more sagacious men in the market will make it a point to get hold of it and accumulate it in excess of their anticipated consumption of it. They will do this because they will see that they can thereby get other things which they do need more easily than in other ways. With the accumulation of a given kind of highly saleable goods in excess, by a few men in the group, in the expectation that the surplus will subsequently be used to buy other goods, as yet perhaps not specifically determined, we have, not money, but a big step toward money. At first only a few grasp the great idea. They succeed and become wealthy. Then others see the advantage of the thing, and imitate them. The prestige of the wealthy and successful men would induce imitation even if the advantage were not clearly seen. Then a tradition and a custom grows up. With the growth of tradition and custom, picking out one or a small number of things as particularly desirable objects to accumulate because of their saleability, with the practice of accumulating these articles in excess of intended consumption, money becomes an accomplished fact. There is no need for agreement or legislation. Money is not, in its origin, certainly, a matter of law or conscious public planning. With the development of a highly saleable article into money, moreover, we have further a great increase in that saleability itself. The quality which made the practice possible becomes greatly enhanced by the practice. Menger thinks that this leads to an absolute difference between money and goods. The money article, which formerly was merely superior to other goods in saleability, now becomes absolutely saleable. The absoluteness of this distinction, which would make it a distinction in kind, rather than in degree, seems to me not to be sound. I think that the distinction remains a distinction of degree. For one thing, the development of money, while it adds to the saleability of the money commodity, also adds to the saleability of other goods. Two things must be exchanged, in order that one may be. It is the business of money to facilitate exchange, to overcome the difficulties of barter, to bring about the fluid market. And it does this not merely by acting as a medium of exchange. The fact that goods can be priced in terms of money, can have a common measure of value, makes barter itself easier, as I have shown in my chapter on barter in Part 2. There are many articles in trade at the present time whose saleability is not much less than that of money in ordinary times. Wheat in the grain pit is surely highly saleable. Stocks and bonds are. If it be objected that in the wheat market there is always some difference between buying price and selling price, if considerable quantities are involved, it may be answered that the same is true in the money market. The man who has just negotiated a 3-month loan of $500,000 at 3.5% may well have trouble in turning that loan over to someone else immediately without shaving 0.25% from the money rate. Besides, it is not true that values remain unchanged when a big buyer shifts from the bull to the bear side of the market. Buying price is higher than selling price in that case partly because his economic power has ceased to sustain the value of the wheat, and the price would not correctly express the value if it remained uninfluenced by that fact. Further, as we shall see when we come to the analysis of credit, one chief function of modern credit is to increase the saleability of goods, and to enable men to use the value of their goods in effecting exchanges without actually alienating their property in the goods. It seems to me that the drift of modern systems of exchange is toward closing up the gap between money and goods, in respect of saleability, rather than to widen it. But this is to anticipate later discussion. It is not necessary, in answering our second question, as to the reasons why gold and silver have become the standard money of the world, to go far in the study of primitive monies. Wheat has almost never been money. The value of wheat sinks rapidly with increase in supply, and is very unstable. Wheat meets some other tests that fit it for money, as easy divisibility, ease in standardization, and even has some degree of durability, though subject to deterioration and waste with keeping, and involving expense in keeping. Carlyle and Ridgway think that wheat was used to some extent among the Greeks in southern Italy as money, at one time. But this was possible because there was a regular export trade in wheat, the same thing that made tobacco available as money in Virginia. In general, however, commodities which minister to easily satiable wants are ill-adapted for money. And that is especially true of current stocks of goods currently consumed. The accumulation of money, moreover, implies a stage of human development where the accumulation of capital is possible. It implies foresight, the suppression of present wants in the interest of future wants, and almost always money has been a commodity well suited to serve as provision against future contingencies. Cattle, slaves, knives, fishhooks, cooking implements, and similar things have been money. The store of value function manifests itself early. But very early a different sort of commodity comes in. Articles of ornament early begin to take the place of articles that minister to more animal wants. It seems strange that articles meeting wants which are commonly counted frivolous and fanciful should distance those obviously necessary in the race for a place as money. It seems strange that the nations now at war should seem more concerned about their gold supplies than about their wheat supplies. But it is none the less a fact that men in all ages have been enormously concerned about ornament. In warm regions, ornament has commonly preceded clothing. Very early, necklaces, bracelets, rings, earrings, nose pendants, etc., became objects of exceedingly great desire. And very early, gold and silver were used for such purposes, and men made long expeditions for them and fought wars for them in very early times, before the money economy was developed far. Other ornaments than those made of gold and silver have also become money. Wampum, polished shells, iron ornaments, etc., have all been money. The Karaks of California were accustomed to use strings of shell ornaments as money. When this was supplanted by American silver, they used strings of silver coins as ornaments, dressing their women lavishly with rows of silver dimes, quarters, and half-dollars. Ornament and money are freely interchangeable in primitive life. Today, in the Western world, the thing is more specialized and differentiated, and the interchange of money and ornament is largely confined to jewelers, bankers, especially international bankers, gold brokers, and the mints, through whom the rest of society make the interchange. In India, however, the peasant's hoard takes the form of bracelets, bangles, and earrings for his wife and daughters, and the peasant himself seems to regard them in the double light of provision for future needs, and as conferring social distinction. They are both ornament and savings bank, and are superior to a savings bank from the standpoint of effective saving, since the natives would spend what they put in the bank, but only famine can make them dispose of the ornaments of their women. Saving is a practice not easily started. There are powerful motives in human life making for prodigality. Social prestige comes to the man whose hospitality is lavish. Social expectation, which is the most powerful steady motive power in human life, makes powerfully for prodigality. Thrift is a virtue little esteemed among primitive men, and none too highly esteemed among the masses in most countries. The grudging person, the tightwad, the man who fails to do his share of the treating, the woman who entertains her guests with inadequate fare, none of these enjoy high social esteem. To offset this, a motive equally powerful must manifest itself. It would be considered mean and contemptible for the Hindu to put money away instead of spending it on feasts at marriages and funerals, and in hospitality on other festive occasions. But he gains, instead of losing, in social esteem and prestige, if he decorates his women with gold and silver. Later, the advantage of such a practice as a matter of provision against future wants would get into men's minds, and would become an added incentive to maintain and increase the practice. Thus the frivolous and fanciful side of men's nature furnishes a powerful lever for the development of both money and capital. In the store of value function we find one of the earliest and most significant functions of money. Carlyle offers a wealth of evidence to show this interchangeability of money and ornament among many peoples, at different stages of culture. Three powerful elements of human nature work together in sustaining the value of the metals which become widely used as ornament. 1. Love of approbation. 2. The sex impulse. 3. The spirit of rivalry or competition. In these three we have, perhaps, the firmest basis which it is possible to construct for the value of anything. When religion is added, as has often been the case with the precious metals, the basis becomes solid indeed. Modern social psychology has increasingly made clear the power of the first. Social expectation can take the raw stuff of human nature and mold it into almost any form it pleases. Original, hereditary differences remain. Some raw stuff is so inferior that no high social organization can be built out of it. Some stuff cannot respond very effectively to the social stimuli. But qualitatively, the tendency is for men to become what society expects. Individuals succeed more or less in meeting social expectation. But the very elements of individual aspiration and ambition, the very self of the individual, are molded to the social pattern, and, with the same racial stock, vary almost indefinitely from time to time and from place to place with the mores. If ornament confers distinction, and almost everywhere it does, men will seek to possess ornaments. Commonly it is for the sake of the other sex that men seek ornaments. Ornaments are an aid in wooing. Men gain wives by being able to give them ornaments. Not that this is the whole story. And social expectation, almost everywhere, requires that men decorate the wives that they have won. Wives usually reinforce social expectation in this matter. Further, the desire for ornament is competitive. One's women must be better ornamented than the women of one's neighbors, if distinction is to be gained thereby. But this sets a faster pace for the neighbors, and the standard of social expectation is raised as to the necessary amount of ornament. It is the same sort of competition that arises among armed nations. A new battleship for one requires that all increase their naval strength. New armies in Germany call for new armies in France. A vicious circle is created. The desire for ornament, unlike the desire for food, becomes insatiable. And hence, the value curve for the metal used as ornament sinks very slowly, being reduced, not by satiation of want, but by limitation of economic resources. I need not elaborate these notions further. They are of the same sort that Veblen has developed in his theory of the leisure class. They rest on fundamentals in human nature, however much they differ from the psychology of the economic man. They give assurance, I think, that, unless radical change in tastes and fashions come in, which displace gold and silver from their position as ornaments and as means of display, we may expect the value of gold to maintain itself at a high level regardless of great increase in quantity. I do not share the view which Carlyle himself seems, at times, to express that gold does not sink in value with the increase in quantity. It seems to me easily demonstrable that it has sunk, and does sink. But I should expect the value of gold to survive the shock that might come if gold were entirely displaced from monetary use, vastly better than any commodity which serves wants of a different character could stand a similar shock. The demonetization of silver has, of course, not entirely displaced silver from the monetary employment. It has, however, made it necessary for the arts to absorb a greatly increased proportion of the new silver, and not a little of the old silver. The demonetization of silver, moreover, was accompanied and followed by a great increase in silver production. But silver has stood the shock amazingly well. It is, of course, thinkable that the attitude of mankind, under new social conditions, and with new tastes and fashions, may change, with reference to gold and silver. Love of approbation and distinction, the sex impulse, and the spirit of rivalry are eternal elements in human nature. But their manifestations may change. There have been times when love of distinction gratified itself in poverty and filth and asceticism. Almost anything may be exalted into a social ideal. Society may even reach ideals of such a sort that a man may gain social approval and the love of woman in high competition with his fellows in the service of mankind. But even here gold and silver may have a place. They are beautiful, as we now see beauty, and beauty itself is good. The world is better if it has beauty in it. It is just as well to conclude at this point what I shall have to say regarding the value of gold as a commodity. The same quantity of gold and silver may have widely varying values, depending on the distribution of wealth and power. It is not alone intensity of individual desire that controls values, but also the social weight of those who manifest the desire. And this depends on the legal and other institutional values concerned with social organization. The point is strikingly illustrated by Walker's account, designed for another purpose, of the effect on the values of gold and silver of the conquests of the great Eastern empires by Alexander the Great and the Romans. The production of gold and silver, for the great Eastern empires, was like the rearing of the pyramids in Egypt. All power was centered in the hands of a few despots. Control of vast masses of laborers was in their hands. The social values, it is difficult to classify them as legal, economic, and religious, since all three are blended, gave little weight indeed to the desires of the masses, and tremendous weight to the slightest whims of the despot. Thus, since the love of gold and silver was intense in these despots, and since religious considerations also called for the accumulation of great treasuries of gold and silver, enormous numbers of laborers, living miserably, toiled in the mines to produce them, and amazing stores of gold and silver were accumulated. The precious metals had, in these Eastern empires, a high value per unit, since so large a portion of the social energy of motivation attached itself to them. With the conquests by Greeks and Romans, however, a great change came. The old, gold-loving despots lost their power. The conquerors had vastly less love for gold and silver for their own sake. Moreover, the leaders among the conquerors had very much less power in their own social systems than had the Oriental despots. Their soldiers were in considerable degree free mercenaries, who had a right to a share in the spoils, and who cared much less for hoards of precious metals than for many other things. In the new regime, the social center of gravity was changed. There remained few who loved great stores of precious metals who had power enough to accumulate them. Mining on the old basis was impossible. Though slavery persisted, More and more of the labor of slaves went into the production of things that the masses of men could consume. Gold and silver sank enormously in value. Radical readjustments in the distribution of wealth in our own day might well make substantial changes in the value of gold, without any change in its quantity. That a more equal distribution of wealth and power, however, would lower the value of gold now, as in the case just discussed, is not so clear. The masses in the Western countries are already fed and clothed, as a rule, even in times of adversity, and usually increasing income for them means increasing expenditure to satisfy less pressing wants, and particularly to satisfy wants connected with social esteem. The laborer's wife gets an expensive cab for her baby when she can afford it. The Negroes have gold fillings put in their front teeth, sometimes when the teeth are sound. The practice of giving wedding rings, and even engagement rings, is spreading among the poor. Our American rural poor, of pioneer stock, have had less concern for gold and silver ornament than the masses of the Asiatics and recent European immigrants. But among the rural poor in America, as city standards spread, the tendency to use gold and silver ornaments seems to be increasing, while we may with considerable confidence expect, I think, that the rise of the immigrant to better economic conditions will mean a larger use of gold and silver on his part. Gold leaf on ceilings and radiators would cease, doubtless, except for public buildings, if great fortunes disappeared, and the use of gold, at least, for plate, would be impossible in an economic democracy. Silver might well gain in value at the expense of gold if there were radical changes in the distribution of wealth. It is notorious that prosperity among the agricultural masses of India is promptly followed by absorption of gold in that country. I venture no concrete conclusions on this point, beyond the general conclusion that a redistribution of wealth, with no change in the quantity of gold, might well be expected to alter the value of gold. It may be added that the general impoverishment of Europe, growing out of the present World War, will probably lower the marginal value of gold in the arts, and hence as money, in considerable degree. From this cause alone, to say nothing of causes growing out of the money employment of gold, and growing out of the values of goods other than gold, we might expect higher prices after the war than before the war, for articles of consumption. You've been listening to The Value of Money, Part 6. Thank you for joining The Winner's Voice. Part 7 will be available in the next video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful audiobooks.